We are launching Amplify Influence, a group for executive women to nourish themselves, network, and become powerful, influential leaders.
So are you ready to talk about the big projects we have coming down the pipeline? I know, me too. Okay. Well, I'm really excited to have this dialogue with you and ask you a few questions that might intrigue the ones watching this. So let's start with this one. You have a lot of experience understanding and working in corporate systems and in the role that leaders or executives play in employee well-being. So could you help us to understand the connection with executive influence and the employee's well-being?
Yeah, so let's start with just influence, because this is actually a thing that we hear a lot about, but that there's actually a lot of science behind it. So when it comes to influence, I want to just share some of that science. So in human motivational theory called self-determination theory, there's a phenomenon that's been studied where people will adopt the behaviors that are endorsed by others for their need for belonging. And it has a really fancy word, autonomous extrinsic motivation, which really speaks to influence. The way in which we show up in spaces in our authentic selves can help lead others. And so what I find in the corporate wellness, employee engagement, corporate systems space is a lot of focus on what's broken and naming it, and that can be valuable, but the piece that I find really lacking is in our own awareness of our own authentic leadership and how that influences change in spaces. And I really want to give women the opportunity to dig deep within themselves, to unpack that authentic leader that's in there. Because once we do that, it really doesn't matter what problem comes up if that executive leader can find in herself a way to respond to that, and she does so with a lot of passion and authenticity, then she can walk through a lot of barriers and people will follow her through them. So that's really the other piece that's missing, besides just naming and analytically responding to systems issues.
Yes. And so when we think about that in the context of our overarching theme, how does a leader amplify their influence?
So the key word here is that authenticity piece. So in marketing research, they understand that there are some people who are more influential than others. There are some people who are going to be more likely to get us to shift our purchasing behaviors than others. And they wanted to know why. So of course they studied it so they could capitalize on it. Their science bore out that when we are authentic and passionate and knowledgeable, so knowledgeable is not a problem for executive women. We are smart and we know what we're talking about. I think oftentimes we have been put in systems that weren't designed for our success. So we learn coping mechanisms to chase that next goal, to chase our approval rating, and so on and so forth. But in reality, when we become really powerful, it's when we can do that internal work to break down the things that are preventing us from showing up authentically in leadership spaces. And this is where, when you and I were talking about building this work, I saw massive potential, because your work with the Enneagram allows us to do that work, to really get to know ourselves and to understand when we show up and we're chasing, and what does that look like, and what are the things that get in our way. So for me, when I have been in corporate spaces and I want for leaders to be more influential in their response to the systemic barriers that are occurring, there's this other large piece of the work that needs to come with understanding the self, so that we can understand or deliver authentically for people, right? And that's where this partnership comes in with the Enneagram and the energy work alongside. Now, how does that play out in real life? right?
Yep.
When you come up against a really tough situation, system, or employee at work.
Yep. Yeah. I think the word that comes to mind for me is assimilation, right? Like what happens when we're placed in different surroundings as we start to assimilate and adapt to survive, right? And I think that women have done a fabulous job of assimilating and adapting to survive in a workplace that has traditionally been designed for men. And so now it's time, as we continue to progress as a society, to really dismantle those layers and constructs that have been built around us, and to lead with authenticity. And I also think, Maggie, that by women leading with authenticity, that also empowers men to lead with authenticity, because they fall victim to the systems in place as well, right? It's just that they're designed for men. So it's not as easy to recognize or necessarily find a place of discomfort like it is for women. But I do think it's powerful and crucial for us to lead with authenticity. And I think that this work is very exciting.
Yeah, and I'm just going to finish this out by saying what comes to mind for me is there's this ancient Greek word, exousia, and it means we grant authority to the things that show up out of the core of their essence. And so what happens when you said, when women show up and lead in this way, they become real change makers, because when other people watch that person show up and lead from the core of who they are, I grant authority to that. I'm like, I see that. That's real. That's true. And I want that for me.
I love that. Well, thank you for answering these questions. I look forward to our next session.